It was a scorching afternoon, the kind that left the pavement shimmering with heat, when a well-dressed black man stood by the curb, flagging down a taxi. The driver, an older man with graying hair and a scowl etched deep into his face, slowed his car as he approached but immediately frowned when he saw the man. Without a second thought, the driver waved him off, muttering under his breath about not wanting to deal with someone like him. What the driver didn't know, however, was that this man wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner of the very taxi company the driver worked for. The black man stood frozen for a moment, the heat of the day now mingling with the heat rising in his chest. He watched the taxi drive off, his hand still outstretched in disbelief. He had dealt with discrimination before, but not like this, not so overtly, not so openly. He knew the driver hadn't recognized him, but that didn't make it any less hurtful. After a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number for his company's main office. It rang only once before a voice answered. "Hello, this is Tom from the dispatch. How can I help you today?" "This is James, the owner," he said, keeping his voice steady, though a storm was brewing within. "I need a cab to come pick me up." "Of course, Mr. James. Where are you?" He gave the location, his heart pounding as he hung up. He was about to make a point, but he wasn't sure if it was going to be a lesson for the driver, or a lesson for himself. Would he allow the hate to define his day, or would he turn this around? Minutes later, another taxi arrived. The driver, a young woman with bright eyes, pulled up to him, her smile a stark contrast to the encounter he'd just had. "You need a ride?" she asked, voice warm and welcoming. James nodded, stepping into the backseat. "Yes, I do, but I want you to drive me somewhere first." As they drove through the streets, James watched the buildings blur by, his mind still racing. It was clear to him now that he couldn't just sit idly by. The time for change had come, and he was ready to take the first step. The young woman glanced at him through the rearview mirror, sensing his tension. "You all right back there, sir?" James sighed deeply, his fingers tapping on his knee. "I will be, once I make a call." James pulled out his phone again, this time dialing the number for his company's office. As the phone rang, he couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration. He had worked hard to build his company, to offer a place where people could earn a living with respect. And yet here he was, being treated like this, simply because of the color of his skin. "Hello, Mr. James?" The voice on the other end was the same, but this time there was a slight tremor in it. "Tom, I need you to pull up the driver's name for me. The one who just drove by and refused to pick me up." There was a pause before Tom responded. Sure, Mr. James. One moment." The sound of typing echoed through the line. "His name is Bill Johnson." James's grip on the phone tightened. "I need you to have him meet me at the office. Now, and don't tell him who I am." "Of course, Mr. James. I'll get him right there." After hanging up, James leaned back in the seat, his mind racing. What would Bill do when he saw who he really was? The driver, like so many others in the city, had no idea that the man he had just dismissed was his boss, the owner of the taxi company he worked for. It was a cruel irony, but it was also the perfect opportunity for James to address the discrimination that was so deeply ingrained in the system. The cab weaved through traffic, and as they neared the company's office, James felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He was no longer going to tolerate this. He was going to stand up for himself, and he was going to make sure that everyone who worked for him knew that this behavior would not be accepted. When they arrived at the office, he stepped out of the cab and walked straight into the building. The receptionist, a young woman with dark hair, smiled at him as he passed. "Mr. James," she greeted, though she still didn't realize who he was either. James walked to his office, opened the door, and sat down behind his desk. He was waiting for Bill now, preparing himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. The door swung open, and Bill entered, his face unreadable. When he saw James behind the desk, his expression faltered, and for the first time, the older man seemed unsure. "Mr. James," Bill stammered, looking uncomfortable. I didn't know it was you." James stared at him, unblinking. "No, you didn't. You didn't know who I was. But you did know enough to make assumptions about me based on the color of my skin." Bill's face reddened, and he took a step back, as if ready to flee. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to. But you did," James interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was a hardness to it. "And that's why we're having this conversation now. I built this company so people could earn an honest living. I didn't build it to become a place where people are treated like second-class citizens." Bill's mouth opened and closed as if he were searching for the right words. I didn't know you'd be offended. Don't make excuses," James said sharply. "You judged me before you knew anything about me. You treated me as less than because of how I look. And that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in my company. And it shouldn't be acceptable anywhere." The silence between them grew thick, and James could see that Bill was finally realizing the gravity of the situation. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cap. His gaze cast downward. "Mr. James, I'm truly sorry," Bill finally muttered. "I was wrong." James studied him for a moment. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Bill. This isn't about an apology. It's about change. I'm not going to pretend this kind of behavior is okay. It's not. Not for you. Not for anyone else. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take responsibility for your actions. And we're going to have a talk about diversity and respect. And if you're not willing to learn from this, then you don't belong here." Bill nodded, his eyes now meeting James's with genuine remorse. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." James leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Good. Because everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like. And that's the standard I'm holding everyone to from now on." Just then, the young female driver from earlier, who had picked up James, walked into the office. Her curiosity piqued. She glanced between James and Bill, sensing the tension in the room. James looked at her and smiled. The first real smile he'd shown all day. "Thanks for the ride," he said. "I think you're going to see a lot more of this company soon." And with that, the journey towards change had begun. The young woman, still standing by the door, nodded and gave a tentative smile. "I'm just doing my job, sir. But if you need anything, I'm here to help." James acknowledged her with a nod and turned his attention back to Bill. There was more to say, and Bill needed to hear it all. "We're going to set up a company-wide meeting, Bill," James continued, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let this be swept under the rug. It's time to address this issue head-on. Because if one driver has this mindset, it's likely there are others. We can't have that in this company." Bill swallowed hard, clearly feeling the weight of James's words. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." James glanced out the window, his thoughts momentarily drifting. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the city, and he thought about everything that had led him to this point, the long nights of working to build his business, the discrimination he had endured, the struggles he still faced, and now, the chance to create change. "I've worked hard to get where I am," James said, his tone softer now. "But I'm not the only one who's worked hard. Every driver, every employee here has a story, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. If you can't see that, then maybe this isn't the place for you." Bill nodded vigorously, his eyes wide. "I swear, I'll change. I'll listen. I didn't realize. I never thought about it that way." James stood, walking around the desk to stand in front of Bill. "Good. The first step is admitting when you're wrong. Now, the second step is doing better. That means listening. It means learning. And most of all, it means acting like this is not just a company, but a family." Bill seemed to shrink a little in his seat, realizing how serious James was. "I'll do my best, Mr. James. I won't let you down." James let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I hope so, Bill, because this isn't just about you or me. It's about everyone who relies on this company for a living. And I'm not going to stand by while anyone is treated less than they deserve." There was a long pause as Bill processed the gravity of the conversation. Then, just as he was about to speak again, the door to the office opened, and the receptionist poked her head in. "Mr. James," she said, her eyes flicking nervously between him and Bill. "Your meeting. The team is waiting in the conference room." James nodded. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be there in a minute." Turning back to Bill, he added, "We'll start with the meeting. Get your act together, Bill. This is your last chance." As Bill stood up to leave, James felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. The hard part was over. But the real work was just beginning. How much would the company change in the coming months? How many people would truly listen? And how many would resist? As he walked toward the conference room, James reflected on the many roads he had traveled to get here, and the many more he still had ahead. But one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The team gathered in the conference room. A diverse group of drivers, managers, and office staff all seated around the table. As James entered, all eyes turned toward him. A mix of curiosity and uncertainty in the air. "Thank you for being here," James began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I know there's been tension. I know some of you are nervous. Some of you may feel uncomfortable with what I'm about to say. But we need to have a conversation. A real one. About how we treat each other. About respect. And about the values that I want this company to uphold." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. He could feel the weight of their stares. But he held firm. Discrimination, racial, gender-based, or any other form, is not going to be tolerated in this company. If I catch wind of it again, there will be consequences. This is a place where we lift each other up, not tear each other down. And if anyone feels uncomfortable or sees something wrong, you have a responsibility to speak up. No one should feel less than because of their background, their appearance, or anything else. A murmur ran through the room, and James saw a few people nodding. He wasn't sure how deep the change would go. But this was the first step. The conversation had to happen, even if it was uncomfortable. Especially if it was uncomfortable. As the meeting continued, James spoke more about company values, diversity training, and his plans to implement stronger anti-discrimination policies. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road he was ready to walk, one step at a time. The meeting stretched on for another hour as James laid out his plans in detail, addressing everything from the need for diversity workshops to stricter protocols for reporting discrimination. The room was quiet, each person processing his words in their own way. James could sense the uncertainty hanging in the air. But there was something else, too. A glimmer of hope. A recognition that things could be better. When the meeting finally concluded, James stood up and looked around the room one last time. This is just the beginning. Everyone, the changes we're talking about won't happen overnight. But they will happen. It starts with each one of us. If we're going to move forward, we need to do it together. As the team began filing out of the room, Bill lingered behind, his posture still stiff but more reflective than before. He waited until the others had left and then made his way toward James. His eyes downcast. "Mr. James, I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me. I don't deserve it, but I'm going to make it right. I swear." James looked at Bill, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're welcome, but you've still got a lot of work to do. Don't think just because you're sorry that it's over. Now, you show me you've learned." Bill nodded, his face earnest. "I will, I promise." As Bill turned to leave, James stood there for a moment, contemplating everything that had just happened. The weight of the day was beginning to settle in, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of quiet pride. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be resistance, maybe even more than he could anticipate, but he was determined to see it through. That evening, as he left the office and walked to his car, James couldn't help but think about the long road ahead. He would need to follow up on the diversity training, make sure every employee had access to the resources they needed to learn, and ensure that any future issues were addressed swiftly and with transparency. It wasn't enough to say things were going to change. He had to make sure the changes were lasting. As he pulled out of the parking lot and drove through the city streets, the noise of the day began to fade. The streetlights cast long shadows on the road, and for the first time in a while, James felt a sense of calm. But even as he drove, his thoughts kept returning to the faces of the drivers, the employees, the people who had silently witnessed the same kind of injustice over and over again. He couldn't ignore them any longer, and as much as he had hoped to find peace in his efforts, he knew there was still so much work to be done. James had begun to make a change, but he also knew that change, real change, didn't just come from one conversation or one policy. It came from the everyday actions of every person involved. He wasn't just trying to change his company, he was trying to shift a culture. And that would take time. As he pulled up to his apartment and parked his car, James sat in the driver's seat for a moment longer. The weight of his role as both an employer and a catalyst for change had never felt so heavy. Yet so important. He wasn't just the boss anymore, he was a leader. And the responsibility was his to bear. He stepped out of the car and walked up to his apartment, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. But for tonight, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace, knowing that the work had begun. And that he wasn't alone in it. The next day, when he arrived at the office, there was a different energy in the air. Employees greeted each other with more openness, a tentative smile here and there, an unspoken acknowledgement that things had changed. James walked past them, his gaze steady, but inwardly, he was relieved. The first small steps had been taken. Just as he entered his office, Sarah, the receptionist, stopped him. "Mr. James, there's someone here to see you." "A customer?" James raised an eyebrow, a bit surprised. "A customer? This early?" She nodded. "He insists it's urgent. Says he's from a local news station." "Curious." James nodded and followed Sarah to the lobby, where a man stood, his camera crew in tow. He was dressed in a sharp suit, holding a notepad as he introduced himself. "Mr. James, I'm Robert Harris from Channel 9 News. I hope I'm not interrupting your day, but I've heard about the changes you're implementing here at your company. Would you be willing to discuss them on camera?" James froze for a moment, the unexpected nature of the visit catching him off guard. The thought of having his words broadcasted to the public, his company's policies under scrutiny, it was a lot to process. But then, something clicked inside him. This was exactly what he needed to push the message further, to show others that change could be done, and that it should be done. He took a breath and nodded. "Sure, let's talk." The camera crew adjusted their equipment, and the interview began. The camera's red light flickered on, and Robert Harris gave James a nod, signaling for him to begin. James took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking into the lens. "Thank you for having me," James began, his voice calm but confident. "I'm here today because my company, like so many others, is at a turning point. For too long, there have been underlying issues that we've ignored, issues of discrimination, of unequal treatment. But today, I'm announcing a commitment to change. It's not enough to simply run a business. We have to be better than that. We have to be responsible for how we treat people, both our employees and our customers." He paused, letting his words sink in, the gravity of the moment settling in his chest. "We've started implementing diversity training for all staff, along with new protocols for reporting and addressing discrimination. But this isn't just about policies. It's about creating a culture of respect, where everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, feels valued. This is a journey, and it's not going to be perfect. But I'm committed to seeing it through." The crew exchanged looks, impressed with the sincerity in his words. Robert nodded thoughtfully, taking a step closer with his microphone. "Mr. James, what led you to take this step? Was there a particular moment that made you realize this needed to happen?" James's gaze shifted briefly, his mind flickering back to the incident with the driver, the moment when he saw the blatant disregard for his humanity. It was that moment that crystallized his resolve. "Yes," he said quietly, "a moment of rejection. I was refused a ride by one of our own drivers, simply because of the color of my skin. It wasn't just an isolated incident, and I realized that if I don't take action now, nothing will change. We can't wait for others to fix it. We have to lead by example." There was a beat of silence as Robert absorbed his words. Then, he smiled. "That's a powerful message, Mr. James. Do you think your company is ready for the challenges ahead? Is this change something you think your employees are prepared for?" James leaned forward slightly, his eyes unwavering. "I hope so, but I'm not expecting immediate perfection. Change takes time, and there will be mistakes along the way. But if we all commit to doing better, to learning and growing together, then yes, we can make it work. It's not just about changing the company, it's about changing the way we think about each other." The crew wrapped up the interview shortly after, and Robert thanked him for his time. As they packed up their equipment, James stood still for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. His words were out there now, on the record for everyone to see. There was no turning back. But strangely, he felt a sense of peace. The public nature of the interview meant that James had opened himself up to the scrutiny of the world. He would be watched closely, his actions, his decisions, everything would be measured against the promises he had made. But for once, he wasn't afraid of that. It was time for change. And he was going to lead it, even if it was difficult. Later that evening, as he walked home through the quiet streets, James felt the weight of everything he had started to settle more heavily on his shoulders. It was exhausting, but it was also invigorating. The quiet streetlights flickered overhead, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the small revolution taking place in one taxi company. When he reached his apartment, he paused at the door, looking up at the night sky. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. There would be challenges. Certainly, some would resist. Others might be skeptical, but he had already taken the hardest step. He had confronted the issue head-on, and he had shown others that change was possible. James opened the door, stepped inside, and smiled softly to himself. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow, he would be ready to keep fighting, for his company, for his employees, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. And for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was exactly where he needed to be.